We're in the book of Galatians. If you want to get in your Bibles, we're still in chapter 1, down around verse 15. That's where we left off last time. And we continue on there in verse 15. We'll start at verse 15, and then verse 16 is where we actually were ready to start. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, to reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Again, as we said before, Paul is defending his apostleship against those, as we call them, and evidently Judaizing teachers who are insisting that you've got to keep the old law in order to be a follower of Christ and all the things that are associated with that. And we infer that part of their criticism of his, well, he's not really an apostle. He wasn't one of the original 12, therefore we don't have to listen to him. And what he says is, I would assume they would say heresy. And so that was the issue and the conflict. And so Paul is defending himself and defending his ministry, defending his apostleship. And we talked about being separated from his mother's womb last week. But the next thing that is in the text there is the purpose of that separation. To reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles. So, first question that comes to mind about that, why do you think, and again, thinking back to what we've talked about Paul and his history, his background, his extreme zealousness for Judaism, why is it that you think God chose him, the super Jew, to be the apostle to the Gentiles? Why didn't he get a hold of Cornelius and make him the apostle to the Gentiles? Why didn't he use a Gentile? Why did he use Paul? Mike?
I think God, knowing his heart, knew that his jealousy, you know the word.
Yeah.
It was towards him, not the Judaism so much. So Paul, when he was persecuting Christians, he was serving God, not Judaism so much. God, I think, knew this, and he knew therefore he would be perfect to go to the Gentiles because he wasn't so committed to Judaism as he was to God. And when he come to know Christ and everything, that same zeal would be there to serve God for the Gentiles.
Okay, so his zealousness would be a plus in going to the Gentiles because as Mike is saying, he was working not for Judaism, for Gentileism, if that's the correct way to say it. He was working for God and God's plan and Jesus' plan. That's what he was working for. And once he, shall we say, sunk his teeth into that, he never let go. And that zeal caused him to travel all over the world. Dave, you have a comment?
Back in Acts 9:15, the Lord said that he's a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. Verse 16 seems to be a reason. He says, "For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." Seems to imply that Paul had a penalty to pay for his persecution of the church. That he was given this, and Paul did suffer tremendously in his work with the Gentiles. So, maybe it's just God decreed it that way.
Okay, yeah. God said it. God decided it. Therefore, since he decided it, yeah. Elwood and then Janelle.
He was making the same point that I was going to make. And to add a little bit to it, God's will is perfect. And we have to understand that when God has chosen us and given us that responsibility to become his child, we have those responsibilities that we need to be aware of. And we need to do it just like Saul did, Paul, because suffering is part of the Christian life. And it's not just suffering for others, but we have to suffer ourselves to put those sins away that cause us harm. And the body is in a fight with the spirit. And we have to allow that spirit to win. But the only way that we can do that is be obedient to God and do the things that he tells us to do. So we're in the same situation as Paul is. If we're going to serve God, we got to put all these petty things away and get our noses down to the board and do what we got to do.
Okay. All right. Janelle?
It would seem to me that he would be better received by the Gentiles than he would going to the Jews, because he is now contrary to Judaism, or he's found a better way, and the Jews aren't too excited about that anyway, but the Gentiles were.
Okay. They've already tried to kill him several times. The Jews have, not the Gentiles, for his preaching. He'll get that later. But you think about this. Paul can roll out his credentials. Here's what I did. I persecuted the church. I asked for letters for Damascus to haul men and women off to prison because of their faith. And now I'm preaching Jesus. If I can be changed, you can be changed. And so maybe that's part of that reason why he went to the Gentiles. Plus, we've got to remember, Paul, yes, he was the Jew of Jews, but he was an educated man. What we call it, liberal arts education now, where you're educated not just in your field of study, but in everything. Paul was one of those guys who was probably educated in areas way beyond just his faith in Judaism. So he was a cosmopolitan individual who could speak to people who weren't necessarily part of his faith. Yes?
I was going to say the same thing. He was educated.
Mm-hmm.
He was a great debater. God knew that he was going to have to go into the Greeks and deal with them, all of those issues.
Sure, yeah. So he seems to be kind of the perfect one. Steve?
The fact that he was a Jew, and Jews and Gentiles, the association between the two is still an issue at this time. And that, had he been a Gentile and gone to them, they might not have believed him in the same way or been convicted, as much as he was convicted of saying, look, here's my former life, and he may have known of me or heard of me, but, this is proof that salvation is coming to you because I was a Jew.
Exactly. Ellen?
And he was a Roman citizen.
And a Roman citizen. So he could travel freely in that Roman world, whereas Peter, maybe not so much. Yes?
The Gentiles was without God. They didn't have God, and like the Jews had, God. So Paul would have been the perfect person to convict them.
Mm-hmm.
And because he knew the Bible.
Sure, absolutely. He knew it. He knew it from the Old Covenant perspective and the New Covenant perspective. Absolutely. Dave?
All of these characteristics of Paul kind of takes me back to his statement about God setting him apart before he was born. These were God-given gifts that being a debater, being educated, being a Roman citizen, all of these things, it would seem like God lined them up perfectly for Paul to be able to do these things.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And we can't, if we fail to see God's hand in this, Paul didn't fail that because he says that. If we fail to see God's hand in this, then we're missing something. And maybe even more so, failing to see God's hand in our own lives. If we fail to see that, then we're missing something. Because while we may think, well, I'm just a lowly Christian out here in Colorado, that God knows who I am and what I am. He knows you, and he knows what you are, and he knows what your abilities are. And who knows what opportunities he's going to throw in your way and ask, will you take up that opportunity and do something with it? Mark?
I think it's interesting that we know God picked the right person for the job. There's lots of reasons here we talked about. But even having picked the right person for the job, the Jews and the Gentiles in today's world are still a world apart. But if you look at where the predominance of Christians are, where they've come from, it came from the Gentiles. And so he put his best resource together with the best field for harvest, and still it isn't perfect today.
Sure.
Even with God's vision and
Sure.
selection.
because he still gave people free will to say, no, I don't want to do anything about this. I don't want to respond to that, whether I'm a Jew or a Gentile or whatever. I don't want to do that. So it's just interesting. And again, we look at Paul. Paul hadn't given up on his brethren. He didn't just go and ignore Jews to preach to the Gentiles, because what was his practice? Every time he went into a city, what was the first thing he did? Went into the synagogue and preached in the synagogue. So he was interested, and he said on occasions, I wish that if I could be an anathema for the sake of my brethren, I would do that if it would save them. So he still had a love for his own people. He wanted them, but his focus was on Gentiles and preaching the gospel to them. And that's an interesting thing, which I think the Jews of the time had a big problem with, because their mindset about Gentiles was what? Super people out there, good people out there. No, that wasn't their mindset. Their mindset was that they were, the Jews felt about the Gentiles like the Gentiles felt about the Jews. There's just no love lost between the two groups of people. But God had always intended for that to be the case. Gentiles and God's eternal purpose, and we're not going to spend too much time on this, but just a quick reminder. To Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse him who curses you, and in you all families of the earth will be blessed. Not just the Jews, not just your descendants, not just your family, but all families of the earth will be blessed. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3. Genesis 18 and verse 18. Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. And so God had this this is Genesis. This is the beginning. God had that in mind from the beginning. And, with God, a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. We look back, and it took thousands of years to accomplish this. And we say, why so long? And God said, well, it happened yesterday. Because his view of time is different than our view of time, and we have to understand and respect that. Galatians 3, verses 8 and 9, in the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all nations shall be blessed. So then those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham. And isn't it interesting that preach the gospel, the good news, to Abraham? Well, was that the complete gospel? Did Abraham understand what that entailed, what that meant? No.
Abraham believes that he would bring Isaac back to life.
He believed. We're not saying that he understood Jesus, that he knew all of that. But he understood that in your family, all nations of the earth would be blessed. He believed that, and God accounted that to him as righteousness. And so, but it's interesting that the same word there is that the gospel was preached to Abraham. And so part of that gospel is that all nations of the earth can be blessed, again, through Jesus, even though Abraham probably had no idea or fully understood what that meant. Daniel 7 and verse 14. Then to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Again, that's in the prophecies of Daniel's dreams that we read about in that particular narrative. But all peoples and nations and languages will serve him, because the gospel will be given to all in that context. Isaiah 49 and verse 6. Indeed, he says, it is too small a thing that ye should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that ye should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. And so, again, just on and maybe one more. This is Simeon while he was holding baby Jesus when he was brought to the temple. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. And so Simeon understood what had been prophesied, and he understood that Jesus was the fulfillment of that particular prophecy and fulfillment of what was going on there. And so, again, that has been part of God's plan from the very beginning. The Jews couldn't accept that. They had a hard time with that. And so that gave them pause. Fortunately, who were the 3,000 baptized on the day of Pentecost? Jews exclusively. It wasn't until Cornelius and all of that the gospel was taken to Gentiles. And in the Jewish mindset, when during the persecution where they were scattered and preached the gospel in Samaria, most Jews thought that might as well be going to the Gentiles. But Samaritans were kind of a different class of people as far as they were concerned, because they had some Jewish blood in their veins. But again, what does this all mean to us? You and I are here because God chose to save people beyond his chosen people. And that's you and me. Because we're not Jews. Not unless some of you have Jewish heritage I don't know about. I don't know about any in mine. And so as a result of that, we can be thankful for what happened here, that we have the opportunity to have the gospel for us. Saw a hand back here. Yeah, Rick.
In Matthew 22, maybe, where Jesus tells a parable about a wedding banquet. And nobody that the king wanted to invite was willing to come. And he was upset with them, so he destroyed them. And then he offered accommodations and invitations to strangers at the crossroads and in the wilderness. And I'm wondering if that alludes to this situation that we're talking about here, where the Jews have rejected Christ and he was angry with them and therefore opened up the salvation doors, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think exactly what he was talking about. And in the book of Acts, when the Jews was persecuted, what were they told? All right, we're going to the Gentiles. If you're not going to listen, we're going to the Gentiles. If you want to follow us along, great. But we're not going to keep just preaching exclusively to the Jews. And again, just because they rejected him doesn't mean they were given up on. There were apostles who worked, Peter especially, with the Jews and the ones who remained in Jerusalem. And so God didn't give up on them, but he expanded his outreach to include anybody and everybody who would listen to the gospel. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember in our own lives, that the gospel is for all. And there can be no qualifications to that. So, well, it's to all but these people. Nope, can't make that qualification. But these people who've done this, they can't get the gospel. Yeah, they can. So the gospel is for all, and that's got to be our mindset in all of this. And that's what Paul fought for, and what ultimately Paul died for, was the gospel to the Gentile people. John.
You think, put yourself in the sense of being a Jew at that time. Gentiles meant the Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Ammonites, Amorites, Moabites. Those were all Gentiles, and now the Romans. And so when you put yourself in the shoes of a Jew, you think, this is, what Gentiles, they knew their history of nothing else. This goes back 2,000 years for them. And now these people who have mistreated us for all these years are now going to be part of the nation of Israel. Maybe that's why the Judaizers thought, okay, well, they're going to be all peoples, means they're all going to become Jews and convert to Judaism. And we know that in the letters, we know that that's something else that the apostles had to combat.
Yeah. You think about, well, let's just face it. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Moabites, all those people that John named, what kind of people were they?
Pagans.
Pagans. The Assyrians, we know from history, were some of the most violent, brutal, nasty people that have ever existed. And, just the things they did to their people that they conquered were barbaric, and that word's not strong enough to cover what they did to people. And so all of a sudden, here you got Jews who suffered, lost the 10 northern tribes to the Assyrians, and all of a sudden you're telling me we got to preach to these people? You got to be kidding me. And, well, let's use a modern day example. I wonder who the first missionary who went back into what was Nazi Germany after World War II. I mean, I don't know who that was, but wouldn't that kind of translate into that circumstance we're talking about? You know, they're Nazis. They murdered 6 million Jews, and yeah, they don't deserve the gospel. And yet that's not in keeping with what Jesus came to do. And as difficult as that was, somebody obviously said, you know, these people need the gospel. And it doesn't matter who they are, what they've done, and what their history is. Everybody needs the gospel, that good news. And that should be our message to anybody we have the opportunity to reach out to, no matter who they are. And sometimes that's difficult, but it's our calling, if you will. All right? Thoughts, comments, questions?
I got a
Yes.
little comment there.
Yeah.
So I'll share a little West Texas
Okay.
Bible theology with you. Y'all, Jesus was from Nazareth, and Nazareth's just 70 miles north of Lubbock right there.
Okay.
And this whole book is about two things. About God wants everybody saved, and those saved made like his son Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And if God's will for us, according to what Jesus had to say at the tail end of Matthew, the very last chapter, the very last few verses, that we're supposed to do what? Go into the world and make disciples. So how do we get to be a disciple? Is by becoming like Jesus, right? And then we can go make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Paul was one of those guys that, even though he had some pretty hard nudges there, man, you need to change your way kind of deal, like some of us have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of where that deal comes from, is to he did just exactly what he was told to do, was to go and make disciples. And making disciples, open up churches, go to different towns and preach the gospel and do the thing. And we can do the same thing. We don't have to go to Japan over there to teach them to learn them people how to speak English over there. But we can go right out here across the street to some of these homeless folks and sit down and get to know them. I'm judging myself here. We have the same problem with home cities. I mean, the homeless people are eating us up over there. And to go and sit down with those folks and try to figure out what do we need to do to help these folks. And to me, that's what a true discipleship looks like. And to me, that's what Paul looked like all along throughout his mission.
Sure, absolutely. Paul was willing to go anywhere and to anybody in preaching the gospel, and we should be too. Although sometimes I think, if we're all honest with ourselves, there are certain people that we are put off by. And what might be our reaction to those people that we're put off by? Yeah, leave them alone. Well, somebody else will reach them. Somebody else will get to them. Again, we talked about opportunities a few minutes ago, and maybe it's the opportunity that God has put in our way that challenges my faith because I don't want to do that. And yet, it's obvious I'm supposed to do that, and so it's up to me to decide, okay, I'm going to jump in and do something. And again, not always going to be successful, not always going to be welcomed, but that one time that it is, and that one time that it's successful, that's what keeps you coming back, isn't it? Several of you golf, and I won't say I'm a golfer, okay? I get out there, swing a stick, and hit a ball. But usually in every round, there's that one shot that, man, it's pretty. And I'm going to get that the next time. And it goes in the water. Next time, I miss the ball altogether on my swing. And the rest of the round is the same way. But that one shot, it keeps you coming back. And I think that when you think about evangelism and you have that one success, that just feeds the fire that I want to do more. And that should be our mindset, okay? Here's the one shot. Forget all the other times that the ball went in the hole, in the water. Focus on that one thing that worked well and build on that. All right? Thoughts, comments, questions? Elvin.
Well, being that we're a part of the body of Christ, we have our own responsibilities as far as what are our gifts.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand that we do have gifts, and we have to put those gifts to work for the church. There are so many here that I see that are constantly working with other members, helping them in their grief, helping them with their health, helping them with their spirituality. And that's something that we are responsible, each one of us, to do, is to take up the Word of God, understand what it says, and when there's a brother or sister there that's suffering, and we know a few, we need to minister them, we need to teach them, we need to put them on the same page with us. We need to love them. And loving people is a sacrifice, because when you start working with somebody, it takes a lot of your time, it takes dedication, and so many of us are so busy in the world today, we don't have time to help anybody. But we have to understand that that is God's will for us. And if we're not obedient children, then we can suffer the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Anything else? All right. Paul goes on after he said that I'm a preacher among the Gentiles. He makes this point: I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. And just to give you an idea, all of the places in Tan are the modern names for the areas we're talking about. But there's a Damascus, Jerusalem, in the area that we think was called Arabia at that point in time. So across the Jordan River, in the area of what would be modern-day Jordan today. And that was the area that he went to. And there are a bunch of questions here. And I will tell you up front, I have no answers for you. Okay? Why did he go to Arabia? I don't know. What did he do while he was in Arabia? Well, I don't know. And the answer, the reason I answer that way is because we don't have any written record of that. We can guess, we can surmise maybe what happened, but as far as saying, okay, well, Paul he established a church here, we don't have the information to say that, and so we have to be careful about ascribing, because you start reading, looking up, why did Paul go to Arabia? And man, fanciful answers that come out of that Google search about what he was doing over there. It's I don't think I saw one that he went to meet aliens there or anything, but some of them were pretty fanciful about what they thought Paul was doing there. Dave, you had a comment?
Well, we know from Acts 10, Acts 11, Paul had to leave Damascus because his life was being threatened. And so I think the why is because he was exiling himself in Arabia. Okay. And then there are other passages where he talks about Jesus taking him into another reality or something. And that may have happened during that time. But here it says he returned back to Damascus. So, the when and the why, I think, is answered there, but we don't know what happened in it.
Sure. We just don't know what happened with that. And where specifically he went and all of those things, we just don't know that. Here's something to keep in mind, though, or at least something I think about, and this is my opinion that's part of this answer. Paul had spent his life immersed in Judaism. He had the Damascus Road experience, which shook him to his core, I'm sure. Then he started preaching the gospel, and how was he received? Let's kill this guy. And yes, he was inspired of the Holy Spirit. We understood that he had that understanding and that information, if you will, that he needed in order to preach the gospel. But Paul was a human being. And I wonder how long it takes to actually fully wrap your mind around a change that dramatic from the road to Damascus experience to where he ends up going to Arabia. And if maybe, and again, I'm just guessing, if maybe that's not part of this, Paul needed the time to fully embrace and own, if you will, what it was he had become. And maybe that was part of this reason. Again, just an idea. Mike?
Paul talks about how the things he was teaching, he did not learn from men, but from Jesus Christ. So Paul spent some one-on-one, some personal time with Jesus after he met him on the way to Damascus.
Yeah, and it's likely maybe that's where it happened.
And I'm just wondering if that Why did he go to Arabia? Because he was led there by Jesus to spend some time with him. Theory.
In theory, yeah. And why Arabia and not Jerusalem? No Jews there. I mean, the opposition was back there. This took him out of that environment where he could focus on whatever it was. Again, if Jesus was teaching him there or whatever the case was, he could focus on that and deal with that and wrap his mind around that. Then go back to Damascus, and from that point on, it was Katie bar the door, because he was. So something happened in Arabia to him, through him, that when he came back, he was the Paul we read about right here in Galatians and in every other place. Robin?
I think it's important to remember that had he not met Jesus on the road, that there's a good chance that Paul wouldn't have made that choice on his own.
No.
That Jesus, the reason why he became a disciple was because Jesus said, told him, hey, why are you persecuting me and my people? So, I don't think Paul would have made the switch, but I know he would have made the switch.
Yeah.
He still would have been persecuting and stuff. Yeah. So it's important to remember that it's a conscious act on his part to follow Jesus, to do what he was told to do. But as far as becoming what he became, he didn't do it on his own.
No.
It wasn't his own.
Absolutely. And did I see another hand a second ago? Dave.
I'm just saying, I read a novel that was fairly interesting, that discussed this time in Paul's life. It kind of proposed that he went to Petra and got exposure, because Petra was a main crossroads for all of the Gentiles, got exposure to a lot of the Gentile thinking and so forth. And, it was kind of an interesting concept, but Petra would be a good place to go.
Sure, yeah. Dave, first-hand experience with being there. It'd be a neat place to go. Did he go there? Some say he went to Mount Sinai. I don't know how they know that. Again, we don't. There's just no information there. And of course, Sinai is in that little dog leg off to the left there of what was then Arabia. Again, the point Paul is making, which we started with this. Let me back up real quick. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. First thing thinking logically, as best as Kevin can think logically, if I had become a part of a movement that began in Jerusalem with 12 men who are already called apostles in Jerusalem, and I became a part of that movement, what's going to be the very first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to check in with those guys. I'm going to go present myself to them. I'm going to go listen to them. I'm going to go learn from them. But Paul said, no, I didn't do that. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. In verse 18, he's going to talk about when he did go up to Jerusalem, and we'll get to that in a minute, or maybe not today, but soon. Again, Paul is having to defend his apostleship. And he said, I'm not just somebody that was drafted in the second round draft pick and brought into the apostleship for Jerusalem, and then they were my coaches, they were my teachers. He said, no, that's not how I got where I am. I got there directly from Jesus, which is exactly how Peter and the rest of the 12 got there. They were chosen by Jesus, mentored by Jesus, and all of that. He did the same thing for Paul, and that's why Paul, I think, is saying, that's why I can be called an apostle. I am not an apostle junior grade. I'm an apostle just like they were, because although I was called out of time, later, in a different fashion, I still learned what I learned from Jesus himself, not from Peter, James, whomever. And so again, keeping this in context, Paul is defending his apostleship, and that's got to be kind of the main focus of why we think about these things, is because they were trying to say, no, he can't be an apostle, and he's not an apostle, and the end result of that is, therefore, don't listen to the guy. I'm not going to listen to him. You don't listen to him either. And that was their way of destroying Paul's message that he was trying to preach. All right? Thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, Steve.
A couple things. the manner in which Jesus revealed himself to him, you remember, Jesus already ascended. They watched him ascend up to the sky and he was gone. And so the manner in which he came to him, speaks volumes, but also who he was. Remember, Jesus spent a lot of his ministry preaching against the Pharisees, and he chose a person who, at this time, was a Pharisee, to be one of his disciples, to be an apostle. So those are just two significant points.
Sure. Yeah, there was so much miraculous surrounding the apostles and their choice and their lives. That same miraculous stuff surrounded Paul in his choice, or in God's choice to make him apostles. Again, he went to Arabia. He returned to Damascus. We're about out of time, but we'll press on just for a minute. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now concerning the things which I write to you, indeed before God, I do not lie. So, he's converted. He starts preaching in Damascus. They're not having any of it. He has to flee. He ends up going to Arabia. But where did he go back to? Right back to Damascus. And I think that's interesting and significant. We'll talk about that next week. Then spent 3 years evidently there, and then goes up to Jerusalem and meets with a few of the apostles. Mike?
Was it the 3 years, was it after 3 years after he returned from Arabia, or 3 years after he was converted into that?
That's a good question. The question, and one of the things we're going to talk about is looking at Acts chapter 9 and reading those. Is there some find a discrepancy between, or have a hard time figuring out the timeline of this 3 years? Then after 3 years, he went up to Jerusalem. Was that 3 years after he was converted? Was it 3 years after he returned to Damascus? And again, not sure we'll have a complete and satisfactory answer, but there's people say, well, wait a minute, what's the 3 years? And, well, we're out of time, so we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next week. Thank you.